excited to introduce our guest today, all the way from North Carolina, Dr. Donald Shaw, a real Renaissance man, someone who's published hundreds of poems, if not 1,000 poetry. He's written a novel, many scholarly publications in different fields. Very multi-talented individual. This business has been a long time coming. I was a doctoral student at North Carolina, where Dr. Shaw has been a teacher for many years, and he's one of my mentors. And he was nice enough to take me out to lunch one day at his favorite restaurant, R&R. And they give him stuff that's not even on the menu. He's like a VIP there. And he paid for my lunch, which was great because I was a core college student. But he said, I'm going to pay for your lunch, but you just have to bring me out to Oregon. And I said, all right, it's a deal. So like a year and a half later, here we are. So without anything further, let me introduce Dr. Donald Shaw.
Thank you very much. So first I want to ask if you can hear me all right. Can you hear me okay? Thank you for the opportunity to come out here to greet you and other old friends. And my daughter is here, and her friends, and daughter Lauren and Megan, her friend McKean's daughter, so I'm delighted to have them in the group. And Megan is a sophomore here at the University of Oregon, and her brother is a senior, I guess, in the area. So we have a big a group. Had a chance to talk to Pat's class earlier and so forth. And I told the class we were still mad at Oregon for stealing her from us years ago. She was quite a teacher and a scholar. We were sorry to lose her. But we're delighted to have Jesse here and many others from North Carolina in your program. So we're happy to be here. It's sort of like North Carolina West in a way, because there are so many doctoral students here, and we're proud of all of them, actually. So I've been talking to different people about media agenda setting and agenda melding, and I thought today I would make reference to a study, but I'd make a few comments first. And I'll have to watch myself, because the last time I did this, I never got to study at all, and I just made comments. But there are just some big things, I think, to keep in mind. One is I made earlier, I don't think I'll tell you that every time, because I've made all these points earlier, that we're definitely in a period of a paradigm shift in communication. And I pointed out that part of me is trained as an historian, and I know that occurred at the time of the telegraph, successfully done in 1844, because people at the time were aware that they were in a major shift. They didn't know where they were going. Soon thereafter, news from Washington, instead of 3 weeks ago or 2 months ago, if you were in Oregon, maybe 6 months ago or 5 months ago, suddenly went down to, in the eastern part of the nation, to hours. And in the Civil War, after the laying of the cable successfully, then the distance to London became hours. The world changed because we came closer together. And today, as we do scholarship with the new digital media, we have to make decisions if we're using Twitter data or other of the sources of data, is whether or not the time lag between the message and the message source and the audience reception is 1 hour, 30 seconds, 1 minute? Is it 3 hours? I mean, it's a major empirical question. So we're on the edge of having to reinvent communication scholarship in a way to take old concepts and apply them into new settings, because These paradigm shifts are major. I mentioned the telegraph in the 1920s. Radio came along. If you look at the historical record, people were amazed. Sounds through the air, etc. All kinds of newspaper stories about it. And then later on, we had the emergence, about within a few years after the turn of the 21st century, of digital media in a big way, into Facebook and interactivity and so forth. We know we're in a paradigm shift. We don't always know it. In the late 40s, the transistors were developed that replaced vacuum tubes that basically enabled us to miniaturize and individualize media because we have our own radio. You didn't have to listen to the family set anymore, and you could have them in cars and so forth. Mass media technology brings us together at first, like around a big radio set, a big television set. In the early days with newspapers and bars and coffee houses, it brings us together, but with the technology keeping to develop, it fragments us. It's a rule of history. It brings us together and it fragments. And I'm not sure how well that applies in the age of digital media, looking at that. But I think you'll probably find evidence that media technologies on agendas and messaging changes over time as we learn to use it, and we use media to fit to our own interests and desires and so forth. So that's one big point. We're in a period of big change. Media agenda setting is a field now that's about 50 years old almost, systematically being studied. People have been aware of the power of media to set agendas for a very long time, way back in time, in the 19th century and even in the 18th century. People were aware of the power of media. In fact, you can find a line of literature that says nationalism is a creature, in a way, of newspapers, because a nation is, everybody agrees, entirely a construct. It's entirely a construct. So if you put nations together, which emerged a little tiny bit in the 18th century, 17th century, but more in the 18th century, so that by the end of that century, the beginning of the 19th, you had the ability of Napoleon, for example, to assemble a citizen army. They must have had some conception of what they were fighting for in some abstract way. But the point I'm trying to make is that whatever kind of community you're imagining beyond this room is to some extent created. And to some extent it's formed by images that you acquire. I noticed an example of that in my own life today. I noticed that when I came in, my image of Eugene was pretty minimal. I've been in Portland, I've been in Corvallis, but I've never been here. And I knew it would be a lot of trees and so forth. And so when I came in, one of the first things I did was I walked around and looked. So I'm acquiring from my own personal experience things. And then I had a chance to read one of the brochures that new students get when they come in. I discovered that you have this interesting cemetery. Remember, I'm an historian, and there are all kinds of stories about that cemetery. And this is the season where it would catch my attention at Halloween and so forth, with all the clowns appearing. And that there are numerous stories, including claims that they don't know if they're really ghosts or not, but something's going on. And a sweet old lady that walks around, all kinds of things. Then I began to think about your stadium. I saw a picture of it and the history of it, and then somebody told me about the game last Saturday. I won't mention it again. And so all of a sudden, through people, through sources, through mediation, I read your newspaper today too, quite interesting. I enjoyed that newspaper, and looking at different kinds of issues in Oregon, including your Lane County commissioners raising their salaries by a 3-2 vote. Long story on that, I read that. So all of a sudden, Eugene is going to look quite different to me. If I were here a long time, it would continue to flesh out. The image I have of Eugene is based on personal experience, but huge amounts already, I've been here 2 days, are mediated. They're mediated. And that's what I'm saying. Agenda setting and agenda building is about mediation. And while agenda setting is said to say the media tell us what to think about, but not what to think. It's not about attitudes, it's about topics and saliences and so forth. But that's what agenda setting is about. There have been, now since our study published in 1972, there's a study of the 1968 election between Humphrey and Nixon. So we have more than 40 years of studies. There are more than probably 5,000 or 6,000 articles on it in a variety of different countries. Germany is a heavy contributor to it, but most countries have it. It's been South Africa, and France, England, and so forth, have done agenda setting studies, and while the findings vary, for the most part, it shows a residue from the stimulus, i.e. the medium, and the audience, the residue, reflecting those issues and so forth that come in. And so there are hundreds of those studies. And recently there have been another line of studies that said, well, let's don't just look at the topics, let's look at the details about the topics. Let's say, for example, the stories about Eugene, Oregon, and the first paragraph mentions the beautiful green trees and the shrubbery and the rain. Second paragraph mentions football. Third paragraph mentions the cemetery, let's say. That's the way the story is all about, those paragraphs. And you ask the reader, well, what really is about it? Well, the first one is the beautiful, I just think it's beautiful here. Well, what else? You keep probing. Well, they're very interested in football too. Oh, anything else? Well, let me think. They also have the cemetery. They get the actual structure of it, not just the topic, the University of Oregon, but the actual message structures go down. There are probably, I don't know how many, probably 20, 40, there are more than 20, probably 40 or 50 agenda setting level 2, that's called level 2 studies that demonstrate that we not only are getting, it's telling us, maybe it doesn't tell us what to think, but it is telling us what to think about, but it's telling us what and how to think about it, what and how. So it's getting a little bit more into our minds, and now there's network agenda setting in which heavy computer use is made, where you take all the words in a news story and all the themes and you organize. Now those topics are called objects, and the attributes and the details are called attributes. You organize them, doggone if they don't cluster in the media like looking at a star cluster, a big star, a little star, some are bigger, and it's like a whole land, a whole skyscape, if you will. And then you go over and say, well, the voters, how do you feel about this issue? You're asking them separately. They, well, I'm interested in that. That's part of the sun. And it clusters the same way. The correlations are extremely high. It's like, sure enough, maybe there was something to that notion nearly 50 years ago. The press doesn't tell us what to think, but tells us what to think about and how to think about it. So themes to go, themes to come, would have to do with, I wonder if feeling or affect is associated with it. I think it probably will be, and there will be studies that see whether or not the clusters, the issues, the attributes kind of stick together. If they do, because we have feelings about them, and affect becomes a kind of glue, if you will, kind of stick it together. So it leads me to agenda melding. And tonight I'm just going to look at some of the issues in agenda melding and sort of sketch it out. I'm not going to do a great deal of details of this particular study. The study I'm going to talk about is the studies in Twitter data, and I'll come back to that for 2012 in the presidential election, Romney and Obama, and we're replicating that right now, like today, for the current campaign between Trump and Hillary. Easy to remember those names, isn't it? We'll probably remember those names for a long time. But we're looking at how people are used Twitter in that case. Agenda melding makes an argument. And it makes the argument that we, as observers of civic life, have three sources of information or issues or public life, have three kinds of sources. One source are traditional media, what I call traditional media. They're newspapers, network television, NPR, media that sit at the top of society in a metaphoric way, as if at the top of a pyramid, shouting to try to reach as many people in quantity as possible, whether or not those people are men or women or young or old or black or white, or regardless, Christian or Islamic. I mean, they're indiscriminately trying to reach large community aggregates. That's traditional media vertical. That's where theory was developed. On the other hand, suppose it were a pyramid. Those pyramids have all kinds of rows of rocks that go up 440 feet up. The big ones near Cairo do. And on any one level, you know, sometimes there's a level there way up, kind of small, but it's a distinct level. Then there's another level of stones and so forth, down to the great masses of stones at the bottom that support it up. In a way, those all represent strata in our society that are grouped together, not the stones, but we, by choice. We're men or we're women, we may have interests that are associated with that. We're older or younger, we're a Christian or we're sports enthusiasts or we're not. For example, and there are a whole range of media that have developed to fit this, what I call horizontalness in society. And for Sports Illustrated, I think Cosmopolitan is aimed at a particular strata of society, a little above me, incidentally. But I mean, these magazines and other publications are aimed at a particular part of the society, and usually always, well, they're not aimed for mass audience, they're aimed for significant niches if they can get advertising for it. That's what they're after. And this has been true for a long time. I mean, good night. I mean, that vertical and horizontalness have been mixed up. I mean, newspapers have a lot of horizontal content, sports, fashion, society, but they're primarily aimed at a place and a general verticality of the community, with news beats around police and fire and health and all kinds of, it's vertically oriented. Horizontal media are kind of cut it a different way. Whatever causes that group to be there, maybe you're the owner of a Cadillac and you belong to a club with other Cadillac owners, or some other way that you're horizontally grouped economically by interest and so forth. You obviously, I want to make a point here, you obviously can physically gather together. We often do in book clubs and so forth, or you can gather online. You don't have to be with those people at all. Those communities exist whether or not, they exist they're out there, but you have to assemble them. It's sort of like Facebook writ large, where you do your own community. In a way, we're now in a period where it's not where we live that's important. I mean physically. It's where we choose to live intellectually, cognitively, that's in our hands. That is important. I mean, it's important both ways, actually. The actual living and actually how you construct it. Because all communities, big point I want to make, all communities are about communication. When Walter Lippmann talked about the media illuminating public life in complex modern society in the 1920s in his book, Public Opinion, it was too complex to understand New York anymore unless you have mediation to newspapers that throw a spotlight on the significant parts of life. And that's true. I mean, and in fact, we no longer have to wait for the media to do that. We can also look in our own social media, digital media. We can spend plenty of time looking at spotlights and even go to communities that exist online, sort of with our friends and so forth. So what I'm saying here is media allow us easier than any time in history, and it's been true all the way back through history, for birds of a feather to flock together. if birds of a feather can flock together. You can do so digitally. You don't have to go live with someone, although people have lived together. Rich people have, monks have, all kinds of groups have lived together. But now you can also, if you want to, you can be, you can belong to Thailand if you want to go to those kind of sites, get friends, interact. You can create communities. You can live. You have a lot more flexibility. It's not new in human history. People have lived, but you have a lot more flexibility to create that if you want to. In fact, agenda melding, you can take part of the vertical structure, part of the horizontal structure, and mix it. Right? You can mix it. Vertical structure, vertical media tend to be very institutionally oriented, social structures. You got a mayor, assistant mayor, third assistant mayor, councilman, all the way down. You got a president, a vice president. They're very structured. The Army has a 4-star general, then a 3-star, all the way down to whatever rank we may be. We're very structured. Horizontal community is more like the generals talk to themselves, the privates talk to themselves, which they can do. Every single organization today has an audience that is more empowered because social media allow you not only to construct the community, but, and here's a significant thing, get social support for you once you construct it. You don't need to be alone if you got some way to connect with others. You don't need to be alone. That's awful to be alone. And most of us don't spend time alone. We find some supportive environment to do that. Now, to find supportive environments. So the question is, agenda melding is about how we blend media, vertical and horizontal, together in the context of our experience to create personal community. That's what it's about. The book we're working on right now is called Agendamelding: How we use media to find personal community, ... and create the papyrus society. I thought about that because create's not quite the right word, because we've had it for a long time, papyrus society, but it's incremented now, it's strengthening and growing. And that means that, you might say, well, in my view, now this is beyond the evidence, but it's where I think we're gonna go. Every institutional structure is challenged because the lower part of it is empowered more by people who are informed, who are connected, who can group, can be supportive or not. And that means, for example, the President of the United States, it means the President of the University of Oregon, it means the professors in the classroom as well. Because you're part of a very much of a structured, teacher knows what we're doing. Students are now perfectly able to get counter information, to communicate with each, all kinds of things, to evaluate things much more than was true in the past, much more. So you have a more potential for a loosening of commitment to purely vertical organizations. There are some examples of that. You can find examples both ways. But this particular example, I'm going to say this, I was the other day looking at the statistics for the Catholic Church, which is certainly hierarchical, very structured and so forth, except for South America where it's growing, losing power elsewhere. The Methodist, I want to pick on my own religion, the Methodist Church, and it has structures, all kinds of structures, struggling for membership. Presbyterian Church, I don't know why I'm picking out all these examples, I just happen to have looked at them. But meanwhile, these small churches that get under the big tents in North Carolina, we have plenty of them, and maybe the preacher has a college degree, and maybe not, but is an excellent preacher, and he gathers maybe 4 or 5, very horizontal, right? We have, in a way, I'm saying the communication of vertical and horizontal is changing us somewhat into a society that is less institutional and more horizontal. And the question is that dangerous or not? I mean, I'm just saying to myself. For example, I'll add this, that in our first agenda setting study that we did in Chapel Hill, the correlations between the voters and the major media in Chapel Hill was 0.97. That's not causal or anything like that, but you can look at kind of the amount of variance accounted for by squaring that. 0.97 squared is 95. We replicated that study 40 years later in 2008. We replicated it in Chapel Hill, and the correlations were 0.87 when you replicate. I mean, well, maybe that was just sampling error. Maybe I didn't get it right. Maybe we didn't do the. But if you square it, it's 0.75. So if you're going from 9.5 to 7.5, it may mean, I'm just raising this as an issue, it's what we're looking at, it may mean a decline in the power of verticalness relative to horizontalness. Now, I should say the literature right now is very iffy. If you look at studies that say, are people using social digital media to support their views, or are they using it to get new information? It's mixed. It's mixed. There's some evidence that digital media in some studies find people supporting their views, and other studies find enough serendipity in there that it's also serving as a new source of information. So I want to make these remarks because it's the larger picture of what I'm interested in, rather than this simple little tiny little study up here that I'm just going to refer to. The study is just a piece of evidence in an ongoing line of research. And as I said, we're replicating this study right now for 2016. Okay. Any questions at all on that? If you have any questions, just stop me and ask me. Is there any way that light can be made less, or does it come up brighter if you there. Okay. We did this Twitter study, and here is a kind of a summary of Twitter data and how we got to our sample. We took all of the tweets from August 1st through about 10 days after the election in 2012. We're running it even longer this year in 2016 because it's been such an unusual election with so many variations of candidates and so forth, so we're going back. And I just wanted to, I'm not going to talk a lot about the methodology, except that I want to point out that given the state of information that is databases that are emerging and available to us today, sometimes we may find it fruitful as scholars to see if we can't use the already gathered available data to look at some big questions. It's like data skimming or mega data analysis. In the old days, doing a content analysis, which is a very labor-intensive method, is very much the best way, probably, if you sample and do all that, of getting information. But consider how difficult it is to get a body of tweets in some representative sample. Right now, Joe Bob Hester on our faculty is trying to look at the issue of how can you sample tweets to get a representative, when, how, what way, every second. There are studies of that. We're just in the beginning part of it. But my point here is that the databases for communication research are changing, mobile, evolving, and be sensitive to it. If the original study in Chapel Hill required us to content analyze television by actually, we didn't even have recorders, by actually coding the stories as they were presented. They actually went to the newspapers and coded them. All that was coded. And then after we did interviews with actually an area representative sample of voters and so forth, that's very good in 1968. And if you can do that in the present time, it's excellent, but you'll need funding for it. And it's hard to get funding for these old studies. So you may have to show a little ingenuity. Now you can see I just changed my topic a little bit from just what Agendamelding over to making some advice about it. Because some of these data sources, if you can figure out how to use them, may be very beneficial, particularly the young scholars in getting it, because nowadays in our field we have a problem with funding. I think we've always had a problem with funding. This is totally an aside right here. But I'm looking at journals recently. I started looking at the support, whether or not you get support communication journals, and it's rare that people get support other than small amounts of funding and so forth. So I'm just saying there are also databases and things you might be able to use. Tweets, for example, enable you to look at vertical media. The New York Times has tweets, the Washington Post. You also can look at all kinds of all these people here. They also tweet, and so you can actually construct communities or tweets and so forth. I presume that if you're using something like tweets, which are so limited in words, and you actually put in words to try to identify Republican-leaning candidates, so you put in words like Obama, is it positive or negative? Mitt Romney, is it positive or negative? Is it positive toward Romney, negative toward Obama? Some combination of that. So you go through, you can divide up Republican-leaning and Democrat-leaning potential voters. Their tweeters are not even voters, but you know that some people are just retweeting because, like everything else, a small number of tweeters accounts for, I don't think it's quite the 20-80, 20% account for it, but a huge number is repetitious or retweeting. You just hope, if you use this kind of data, that you have enough volume in it and where you can controls on it, that the trash with which it must be filled, if you had a chance to go through tweet by tweet for 13 million, it must, you hope, equalize out. But I raise that as an issue. All that stuff needs to be looked at. All that stuff needs to be looked at. Whereas when you were doing your own content analysis and own survey, you were writing those instruments and developing those, and you tested them usually, and you knew they were right. Now, with these new huge data sets, question is huge volume sufficient? I don't have an answer, although in this case, we obviously thought it would be sufficient. Here's another thing about agenda setting research in general and Twitter too. You can put in words to represent. We put in there words that popped up in the tweets, or foreign affairs, tax, and these words popped up in sufficient quantity that you could actually see what they were. But I've mentioned today several times that the foreign affairs, taxes, unemployment, healthcare, economy, these are really saliences because there is yet to be an in-depth and thoughtful, to my knowledge, study of what an issue is. I mean, I would gather that an issue is a set of public policy priorities that are addressable and could be addressed by citizens. For example, it's higher taxes or lower taxes. And that just saliences are not necessarily issues, but if they appear a lot, it's just like I was saying before, those words appear over and over again, they must be tapping onto something of importance, and we as scholars call them issues. But to you as an audience, to me, I'm saying, I don't know. I mean, it needs to be thought about. It needs to be thought about quite a bit, and probably we need to do more research of a focus group nature in which we just plumb and plumb and plumb how issues are formed, and with representative people, so that we can have a better idea how to do it, even with Twitter data, much less data. So there were 16 that counted up. Notice the huge variation. I'm just noting it in passing, between mentions of foreign affairs and mentions of, say, government. It's hardly even on the register of government if you look at that. And generally speaking, when you do agenda setting research and you have any kind of response, the people who answer questions answer just like I'm going to say. Most times, you're asked, I'm asked, what do you think is the most important issue in Eugene. The fine university needs more funding. What else? Well, they need to have a better preparation for their rain. They get a lot of it. What else? I don't know. That's about it. I mean, most people have very, very truncated answers. And it doesn't even make sense unless you aggregate it across a lot of people. If a lot of people mention needs funding, somebody here mentions funding, and funding, then you say, well, it must be an issue. Well, it might be an issue if that many people mention it and share it, but the whole thing needs to be worked out in terms of issues. And I'm just citing that as an example. I want to show you something you can do if you have Twitter data, and it's fascinating. We could do it for August. We're going from one day to our interval is 1 day, where you're looking at correlations and so forth. And the average of 1 day, as I remember. You could look at Democratic voters, that is people who mentioned Romney negatively and Obama positively, or some combination of that, and how they relate to Democratic media, because Democratic media also have tweets and they have information. Rush Limbaugh does, and so forth. On the conservative side, Stephanie Miller does, the liberal side. We can all think of all kinds of examples. So you can compare the voter, how well they relate to Democratic horizontal media, Republican horizontal media, or the traditional media right down here. And you can also look at how they relate to each other and look at the Republican. I'm not pointing this out because any of those figures are particularly interesting, but they do show some relationships, and you can do that study here any way you want to break the data down. You look for August, and then September, October, the week of the election, after the election, to see if the system does anything or not. That's very interesting because clearly this right here is a measure of agenda setting for Republican-leaning voters. That's a measure of agenda setting for Democratic-leaning. This is a measure of horizontal, that's a vertical connection to the general media. That's a horizontal connection, how Republicans go to Republican media and or how they relate to Democratic media. My point is that you can look at those comparisons, how they go after the vertical media or the horizontal media, Democratic or Republican. Am I making myself clear? I mean, there are all kinds of little nuances in there that you could do because you have all this data. You just say you can do it shorter or longer. You can divide up periods like you want. We arbitrarily did some grouping of them, maybe because actually, I probably shouldn't say this, but we may have grouped it like up at the month level like that because of my age. If I were younger, I might have tried to say, well, that doesn't make sense. I can't even imagine it makes sense to go down to some kind of hour-to-hour basis on tweets. I mean, who sits on a tweet more than they come, they go. I mean, right? Or you ignore them, or you forward them, or something of that nature. Well, I have a number of other charts I'm not going to show you, but I'm just making this one to say we did it for September, we did it for October, we did it for the election week, we did it for after the election, and we found that issues rotated across it. Here are all 16. Just rotating across it. And you can see some issues, yellow, which is government, which appeared, who knows exactly what context, but it appeared a small amount. But some issues were well mentioned up. They mentioned some foreign affairs quite a bit and so forth. You can pursue it, at any rate, across time. We wondered about that issue thing, so we began to look at, I think I'm going to go on to the next one. We began to look at correlations. What if you took those 16 issues and you looked at how August correlated with September, with October, with the election week, and so forth? What if you looked at all 16? Looked at all 16 of the issues. Well, we did all issues. You can see the correlation gradually goes down. There's that blue one up there. So what if it's more important to listen to me than watch that. Suppose you took the top 15 issues, dropped the bottom one. Okay, let's do the next, let's do the top 13. You see what I'm getting at? And you know what? The most powerful number of issues that we have is 7. I mean, it's 7 issues, correlations rose higher than any other point, and close to it are 8 and 6, and not far away are 9 and 5. And then with Malad Manui, my assistant, we were sitting there thinking about this, and we both smoked pipes. We're actually out sitting there smoking pipes, thinking about it. And he comes up with a memory of the article that appeared in the 50s by Miller called The Magic Number 7, plus or minus 2. The magic number 7. And Miller was a psychologist who had people, he'd roll marbles around the students, say, close your eyes, where are all the color? Well, there's a blue one there, a green one there. They can remember 7, plus or minus 2. And that's been replicated in any number of settings. Incidentally, Jess was telling, he was with Ann Cooper Chin, who knows of this research, was telling me that cables, people select 7 cable channels plus or minus 2. So it's been replicated in other ways. We're going to run that down. So I bet you, for agenda setting purposes, this is what I think the implications of this are, with Twitter data, and I suspect other data, is that it's not so much that agendas emerge as agendas are in a constant fight. They're constantly fighting. And if you imagine for public attention, media attention, public attention, media attention, because if you imagine 7 cue balls on a table, I used to play pool, and you hit one, one flies off. So you happen to be a socially conscious student who really wants to improve social life, so you say, well, we're going to have story every day, every week to build an agenda around poverty issues. We'll add that to it. They add poverty issues up here. And it hits, and the kinetic energy goes all the way down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the one you just added 8, or 8 is up here, the bottom one flies off, and it was women's rights. That flew off. So if you want to have, you can't just keep adding all the good, there's a limit to it. And indeed, up at the top, most of the actions in 3 or 4 or 5 issues that they're really up there, and they don't rotate that much. So that's one point I want to make. Are there any questions about that? This study demonstrated. Well, here's a totally different thought. That in agenda setting research, nearly everything has assumed that audiences are just their minds are scratched, to quote Isaacs, that famous psychologist. Their minds are scratched by whatever they see in the media. His work was done studying Pearl Buck, the great writer in China, and found that people who read Pearl Buck, minds were, as he put it, scratched, so that when communism came in, they couldn't see it because their minds were scratched by Pearl Buck's Christian, her father was a missionary, that they were already sort of framed to see China in a certain way. Maybe that's an example. But at any rate, so we've always assumed that, in a way, that it just came in carte blanche and never thought about whether or not attitudes are involved in it. I mean, maybe there's some as Democrats and Republicans make choices, the assumption would be that they would go toward Democrats and go toward Democrats and Republicans go Republicans in the horizontal media, if you see what I'm getting at, in the horizontal media. Not necessarily the vertical, but in the horizontal, if you will. So there's even a study of that. And this was done in the early 60s by Richard Carter, a Western University of Washington, brilliant scholar, now retired, who wrote a piece, Communication and Effective Relationship, and he just said, I'll bet you if you're comparing anything like this, like Canada, like Obama and Romney, these are object one, object two, that in the first thing you do if you're making a judgment between the two or any other concepts, you compare them. We call that pertinence. Pertinence, you compare the two. And then you have a salience to either one person to the other person. We went back and looked at that. That's about all it was to the article. Later on, his student, Carter's student Chafee, tested this in a series of experiments and found it somewhat confirmed a lot of salience and pertinence went in the right direction. So you know the things I just showed you about the Democrats and all those bubbles, and it was saying, well, those bubbles absolutely fit our data because the comparison between the two is the Republican horizontal media, the Democratic horizontal. That's pertinent. That's what they're doing. There's a correlation that shows there. And you've got the Democrats going either one way or another. We got the perfect way to test that for Democrats and Republicans. And if we find that there's some leaning one way or another, we have an example of attitudes involved in choices. There's some examples of attitudes leaning you to a particular the underlying reason why you would select a horizontal media would be attitudes and values. So we said, well, let's see if we can do that. So we did it. And I'm just going to point out one thing. Pertinence, that's always there, the same. It's between the pertinence is the correlation between Rush Limbaugh and conservative, definitely liberals, their agendas, and you see the correlations were pretty high, but they rotated. That's just how they do. What about the Democrats? You would expect the salience, the Democrats would go to Democrats more than Democrats would go to Republican. Democrat to Democrat would be more than Democrat to Republican. In all 5 cases, maybe I should say 4 because the other one's after the election, it went that way. In other words, the Democrats followed their, whatever it is, attitudes, values, their salience favored the Democratic side of it. For Republicans, it was a lot less clear. Republicans went to Republican in August. They almost just about tied in September. Thereafter, the Republicans did not go their own way. They showed a lot of uncertainty in that election, much more than the Democrats. And that's just an example of attitude showing there from the Carter model. We're replicating this. Well, what about that example of ACA, agenda community? I wonder if there are other ways you can compare it. And you can compare it. You could look at all those correlations. I know this is somewhat technical, that agenda community attraction equals 1 less the square, I'll say it, then I'll show you. 1 of the square of Agendasetting level 1 plus basically the horizontal. In other words, if you take account what you learned from vertical media, what you learned from horizontal media, and we weight it so you can compare it, then whatever is left over is personal experience. There are those 3. There's no other way to get it, one way or the other. For example, a correlation of 80, if you put it, a correlation of 80 would lead personal experience of 32, okay? And so if you look at that, you can see the Democrats had a very low score, after the election out, low score. And this means the Democrats were very vertically oriented. They were into television, newspapers. They were into the regular establishment. The Republicans were not. They were more attracted to horizontal, and I don't know whether or not this is Romney. I don't know if they were seeking social support information, but there was something different about them as a group. Okay, here's the point I'm trying to make in this kind of not entirely successful way, that that whatever group it is, whether or not it's Republicans or Democrats, we argue they're going to mix it somewhat differently. They don't use vertical, horizontal media exactly the same way. The agenda in this election of the traditional media was more influential on the Republicans and less horizontal, and for the reverse for Republicans. So, in other words, underneath that, people don't use media the same way. It's not like everybody has the same effect from it. People use media, no, not the media, just use people, right? So you can look at, you can look at this, there's just an example of correlations. Okay, I just want to show you that on that formula, it just shows that the lower the line, the more traditional. That's after the election. Democrats were just perfectly satisfied with the traditional vertical agenda, but Republicans were not. They did not. They were more looser, more unrooted, and they were operating together there. So we argue, well, wouldn't that be true of any groups anyway? Wouldn't you actually use the media in different ways that would fit your own creation of your own personal community? We think so. And I'm not going to talk about that. I just want to talk about one thing more. I just want to show you that, just a little bit of look at that election. Notice how Obama and Romney voters, the week of the election, ranked and discussed issues: foreign affairs, unemployment, economy, healthcare, energy, taxes. There were definitely differences, but if you were to, make a generalization that for the Democrats, obviously foreign affairs were important, and for Republicans, taxes were, and for the Republicans, LGBT was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then thereafter it trails on down. There was some movement, but notice that in most studies of public opinion, when you ask for the big issue, you usually have a dominating issue, or at least a high one, and it goes down like a ski slope. And it goes down pretty quickly, like a ski slope. So, I'm going to back up one, and I'm going to let it go. I'm going to let it all go. Because I just used that to illustrate a Twitter example of some big issues, if you will. So let me draw it to a conclusion and see whether or not you have any questions you might want to ask. One thing, this is just a recap, actually. The reality is we're in a world of change in media use, and I think a change in the way we construct communities. I believe, although I didn't show it here, that that the biggest variable, one of the biggest variables that is changing us as we use different media is age. I think that, based on stuff I've done or read, that people from roughly 14 to roughly 24 get a kind of a media habit or schedule, and then they kind of stick with it. if the medium is available for a long time. It's not to say they don't change a little bit, but they do stick with it. And that as audiences, Robert, let me put it this way. Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone book was really impressive to me because you looked at his charts, not so much about the social capital, but his charts that looked at audiences for different media. You could see the decline of newspapers. It wasn't because newspapers weren't good. They're very good. The audience is simply dying. And you could see it slowly dying. So that when newspapers disappear, it won't because it's the way the community, a newspaper positions itself is a community of place. Eugene, Chapel Hill, Asheville Citizen, Houston. And older people relate to it. Younger people don't relate to communities of place as much, and no matter how good it is, so long as it's conveying a community to which you don't relate, you're not going to use it, no matter how good you are, if you see what I'm getting at. Now, underneath media evolution is the habit and the way you relate to community. Now, I would say if you look at, if you went to the first-year students here and did panel studies of asking that group and then asking their 14-year-old brothers and sisters to come in a separate panel and asking what media they're using, what they're learning, what are they exchanging, including people. People are very important as sources of information. You'd probably have a better idea, I would, of where we're going. Because it has something to do with that kind of community. So you can see why, in my head, community is tremendously important. I mean, I don't think of agendas as terms of everybody learning that same agenda. I think of people who share an agenda in a way are sharing a community, right? In the case of Facebook, you can see people actually identify and create and communicate with communities. You actually create them, you select them and put them in it. And you can see that our ability to create or select among media messages to create a vision of community that fits us personally is within reach. It has been for a while, but we're more aware of it now. You can, take all traditional media, the network television, the old way of thinking about it, ABC, CBS, NBC, reached their high point in 1981. That was the most penetration. Let's see, you have to do this 30, nearly 40 years ago. I mean, at one time, I Love Lucy and programs like that attracted nearly 80% of the audience, a viewing audience. Now the Super Bowl is the most exciting moment, attracts maybe occasionally 28% or something like that, way lower. I mean, the mass media audience is fragmented. So in terms of communication theory, in a way, the period from 1930 to 1980, which personally I regard as the age of mass media, may be, according to Brad Ham, one of my students who's commented on it, may be an aberration. I mean, it may be an aberration. They went through a period in which you had dominating, sweeping, hugely penetrating mass media. And what came with that era? Well, I tell you what came with it. Huge ideologies. Democracy, capitalism, communism, all huge ideologies. And the ideological wars, in a way, fought in the 30s and 40s and 50s and so forth. Now we're fighting more regional enclave communities, right? So in a way, in terms of agenda, in a way, mass communication is, to me, quite parallel with mass armies. I spent a long time in the Army, and I was trained and prepared to go into the full gaps and against the Soviets and have a mass army. If you brought a mass army now to the battlefield, it'd be very vulnerable to drones, to nuclear area strikes. Mass armies don't make any sense. Why do mass media make any sense? I mean, I see a lot of parallels between the technologies that are driving communication and the technologies that are driving everyone else, right? So it's very likely that in the academic setting, one time the lecture method was, in the Middle Ages, kind of a way in which the instructor could read the text, including the Bible, and his students could write slowly and write it down. It was one person speaking, they're all writing notes down. And then Gutenberg enabled us to get many copies of it and so forth. And yet, there's still classes like that where people get up and, in effect, as they did 500 years ago, declare different topics and so forth. Whereas probably, I mean, if you looked at technology and vertical and horizontal, very vertical. I'm the professor and so forth. The other, probably there should be probably the most successful communication going on in the classroom is vertical mixed with horizontal, where students are interacting either with the teacher or with each other in classes, and objectives are spelled out and paths are built to it. Anyway, I'm speculating now that, because it's way beyond media, but consider, I'll close with this thought. I mean, you probably came in and said, well, agenda setting is all about media and politics and so forth, and most of the studies are about that. But actually, agenda setting is really about saliencies and setting them. And in the classroom, the teacher in the textbook set the agenda, and you're even examined on it. You have tests to see how well you got it. And everyone in your personal life is involved with salient setting. You go home, your significant other says, I'm really tired tonight and hungry. Does that mean, is that just a statement? Before long, you're going to be at a restaurant, right? And you make, I mean, if you think of agenda setting in the sense of contextualizing cues and so forth, it's really quite a vibrant way of thinking in terms of how ideas or information is exchanged. And we're in a period in which all that's going on. As I started out saying, as with 1844 and 1920s, I don't know where we're going. I do wish I were young, like Megan, your student back there, and have my whole life to live in the 21st century. My goodness, it's going to be interesting over the next 20 years and 30 years. Very interesting. As the media change and our attempt to grasp and keep up with it and keep up with that change and trying to relate media and audiences in the larger context of society, our hands are going to be full. But I'm sure you at the University of Oregon are going to be well prepared for it. And I hope that's true at North Carolina too. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to. Yes, Pat.
I hate to bring us back down because you ended on such a sweeping note, but you know, one of the things that came out of the early studies was an individual variable on need for co-orientation.
Yeah.
And then you talked about with horizontal media now that it's kind of a mixed bag on whether people are looking to kind of inhabit an echo chamber or take in conflicting information. And it just seems like that's another individual level variable now that needs to get put into the mix, almost kind of a Noel Newman type.
Yes.
You know, how much do you need to just have your beliefs reinforced?
Right.
And I'm wondering how that variable fits into the equation.
I don't know. Yeah, but right now my look is much more general than the specific way that you cited it. But that needs to be done, and that's the kind of thing that are often done by these brilliant graduate students for dissertation, or they take a hunk of that and look at it. But I mean, at a macro level, agenda setting is quite useful in terms of the whole population as a whole. For example, I mean, to me, agenda setting is kind of like the things you get at holidays, and they say, Christmas or Thanksgiving, they say, the traffic officials have estimated that X number of people are going to die in North Carolina that don't drink and drive. And sure enough, about that, statistically, they know about that many are going to die. So, well, who are they? They can't say who they are. I mean, you can't say individually who they are. In the aggregate, agenda setting is useful like that. But if you had a lot more experimental stuff more carefully done, then it would be able to look at a lot of the intervening things. And that's why I said, in a way, I think I would do more kind of open-ended focus groups and just simply listen. I would dearly love to do that. That group I mentioned, have all kinds of words recorded and then run computers over what words appear by men, women, and when they're together in terms of information. In other words, your question is too hard to answer.
Dr. Shaw, so I was thinking about, you said you were replicating the project for
Yeah.
this current election.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking about sort of some of the unique nature of this and what we've seen with a lot of shifts and splits in the Republican Party. I mean, might that influence the way you define your audience?
It may influence the time tables too. We may actually go back and organize up to a debate and then to the next debate and the next debate. I'm not sure how to do that, but all those things are possible, but it takes a lot of time. For example, on this study right here, my assistant has an Apple computer, a big one. I mean, big for home. It took him, his computer, I think, 8 days to run through those Twitter data, 24 hours a day. I mean, he had to practically code, and that's a lot of. Just had to count through 64 million, and go through 64 million again, and go through it again, and then 13 million, and so forth. It takes a lot of time to do that, but I'm not deceiving myself that a large number means it has to be accurate, because I alluded to it must have a lot of junk in that, but he's just hoping that the general trends would do it. But it'd be interesting. For a while you can look at natural and Twitter data, you can look at natural periodization and other social media too. But some social media disappear, right? So that it's a challenge. But if you look at go to Pew, put it on your thing and look at Pew data, where they're always measuring what age group looks at what media and so forth. Very revealing. I mean, it's made a believer of me, along with other data, about age groups determining where we're going, right? I mean, I'm an old newspaper guy, and I hate change. I loved it when I go back. I mean, when I was in the newsroom, they had linotype still working, and I loved it. And I used to go watch the presses run, and all that ink spraying around. I think newspapers are beautiful to look at. I love to read them. I enjoyed reading your paper today, a beautifully laid out paper, and I wish they'd be that way forever. But I noticed that even there's kind of not overloaded with ads. Even your local paper is not overloaded with ads, but it has some, and I'm sorry about that. I mean, I study things. I'm sure we all do. I'm kind of sorry it's happening, but I'm also realistic. And I tend to be somewhat of an economic determinist underneath, and I think that all media rise and fall. I mean, even with the digital media, some have come up and gone down, or they never got anywhere. And of all the current digital, all the near media, Facebook we looked at it not too long ago, underneath the U.S. population, total population, Facebook's the only one that approaches television. I mean, all Twitter is 14, 16 million. We have 320 20 million, 310 million. If you look at it, it's a tiny group. And including in this study, where you have that tiny group, which are probably quite young, right? In this study, which we're looking at, you can't, surely there can't be very many old people in there. There may be, but I mean, we have no way of really measuring that. So there's still, for all my advocacy of using data where you can get it, there's still a good reason why you should use the old-fashioned data gathering methods when you have the funding for it and so forth. And don't deceive yourself that your sheer volume erases all the problems. It conceals them, probably. I have no way to untangle that thing, but I'm sure that Twitter study is young people. They were probably using a lot of violent words to indicate their feeling about Obama or Romney. Other questions? Yes.
Do you expect in this 2016 version to see a bigger split between the Republicans and Democrats in terms of use of horizontal community?
I do. I expect that, and I expect that that vertical correlations may shrink. I don't know. I mean, that's the pessimist in me, since I clearly think, you know, in a way, you think of it, communication covers community, but that's not true for me. Communication is community. It's the same thing. I mean, it's entirely constructed, entirely. Yeah, there's a nation as a construct. So is Eugene. So is the University of Oregon. I mean, there's no one. I mean, it's a construct. And even your significant other is a construct to some extent. You have to think about that one. But even your significant other is somewhat a construct. Thank you for coming to this, and on behalf of my family and her friends, for this visit to this absolutely enchanting part of the world. It's beautiful out here. I don't think I'm going to go home. I think I'm going to stay here. Thank you.